My grandfather was not a wealthy man, but he was rich in determination. In 1952, with nothing but his own two hands and a dream of creating a peaceful retreat, he built our family cabin deep in the woods of Pine County. I can still picture him in the old photographs, sleeves rolled up, forearms strong from decades of carpentry work, carefully measuring each beam before cutting. He chose every log deliberately, selecting the sturdiest pines and securing them with techniques he had learned from his own father. As a child, those summer months spent at the cabin were like stepping into another world. My grandfather would wake me before dawn, and we would walk silently through the morning mist to the small lake just beyond the property line. "Patience," he would whisper as he taught me to fish, his calloused hand steady on my smaller one. "The best things come to those who understand the value of waiting." At night, we would sit on the porch he had built, counting stars and listening to the chorus of crickets while he told stories of our family history. When I turned 12, he showed me how to split wood properly. "This land has been in our family for generations," he told me, wiping sweat from his brow. "One day it will be yours to protect. Remember that ownership is not just a piece of paper. It is about respecting what came before you and preserving it for those who come after." I nodded seriously, not fully understanding the weight his words would carry years later. My grandfather passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 years ago, and according to his will, the cabin and surrounding property legally transferred to me. The lawyer explained that everything had been meticulously documented, just as my grandfather had done with everything in his life. I decided then that I would renovate the cabin as a tribute to him, preserving its rustic charm while adding just enough modern conveniences to make longer stays comfortable. But in the years since my last childhood visit, the world around our secluded paradise had changed dramatically. What was once miles of untouched woodland was now becoming dotted with luxury homes. The development had started on the eastern side of the county, but gradually crept closer to our cabin. Still, I was not concerned. Our property was private, established long before these newcomers arrived. That changed on a crisp autumn morning when I arrived at the cabin to begin planning renovations. A white envelope was taped to the door, bearing an unfamiliar logo, Pinecrest Estates Homeowners Association. Confused, I opened it and pulled out a formally worded letter claiming that my property was now under their jurisdiction and demanding immediate compliance with their aesthetic standards. The cabin, they stated, was an eyesore that diminished property values in their established community. I read the letter twice, my initial confusion giving way to indignation. The community they referred to had existed for barely 2 years. Our cabin had stood proudly for over 7 decades. As I looked at the list of required modifications, replacing the authentic log exterior with approved siding, removing the stone chimney, installing standardized windows, I realized this was not about improvement. It was about erasure. Someone wanted to wipe away my family legacy and replace it with their sanitized vision of suburban perfection. Folding the letter carefully, I placed it in my pocket. My grandfather had taught me patience, but he had also taught me about standing your ground. I had no idea then that this single piece of paper would be the first shot in a war that would uncover secrets buried deeper than the foundation of our family cabin. The HOA requirements outlined in that first letter were not just unreasonable. They were designed to fundamentally alter everything that made the cabin special. The document demanded replacement of the hand-hewn log exterior with vinyl siding in one of 3 approved beige tones. The natural stone chimney my grandfather had constructed from rocks collected from our own land needed to be removed entirely. The charming multi-paned windows, which my grandfather had salvaged from an old schoolhouse in 1954, were to be replaced with standard vinyl models from an approved vendor. Most absurdly, they required that I remove the cedar shake roof and install asphalt shingles in Pinecrest-approved muted gray. The estimated cost for these modifications would exceed $40,000 for changes that would strip away every ounce of character and history from the structure. My grandfather would have been heartbroken to see his creation transformed into something so generic, so soulless. I spent several evenings researching county records online, staying up well past midnight as my kitchen table became buried under printed documents and legal notes. What I discovered confirmed my suspicions. The Pinecrest Estates HOA had been established in 2021, nearly 7 decades after my grandfather built our cabin. According to every legal resource I could find, properties existing before an HOA formation should be grandfathered in and exempt from such requirements. Armed with this information and copies of the original property deed, I requested a meeting with the HOA board president. 3 days later, I found myself sitting across from Karen Williams in the pristine community center at the heart of Pinecrest Estates. Everything about her was immaculate, from her perfectly highlighted blonde bob to her crisp white blouse and tailored blazer. Her smile never reached her eyes as she glanced at my documentation. "I appreciate your research, Mr. Mitchell," she said, sliding my papers back across the table without really examining them. "But your understanding of HOA law is limited. Your property falls within our community boundaries now, regardless of when it was built." "But the county records clearly show," I began. "The county records show what they show," Karen interrupted, her smile tightening. "But our legal team has determined that your property is subject to our covenants. That eyesore might have been acceptable when it was surrounded by nothing but trees, but times change. The Pinecrest community has standards to maintain." I noticed the other board members shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, avoiding eye contact. None of them spoke up. "This cabin has been in my family for generations," I explained, trying to maintain composure. "My grandfather built it himself. It has historical significance." Karen tapped her manicured fingernails on the table. "Historical significance requires official designation, which your property does not have. Now, we are being more than generous with our compliance timeline. You have 90 days to begin modifications." Over the next 2 weeks, the violation notices became increasingly frequent and threatening. The first demanded compliance within 90 days. The second, which arrived just 7 days later, reduced this to 60 days. The third notice, marked urgent in bold red letters, stated that I had 30 days before they would take necessary enforcement actions, and included a daily fine schedule that would accumulate to thousands within weeks. My own research into property law grew more intensive. I consulted online legal forums and pored over county ordinances. Everything I found suggested the HOA had no legal authority over my pre-existing property. I drafted a formal response citing specific statutes and sent it via certified mail to the HOA office. The reply came not as a letter, but as a formal legal threat on law firm letterhead, stating that failure to comply within 30 days would result in legal action against me personally. That evening, as I sat on the cabin porch watching the sunset through the trees, just as my grandfather and I had done hundreds of times, I felt a strange mix of anger and determination settling over me. The woods around me were quiet, as if holding their breath. Tomorrow, I would need to leave for a mandatory 3-day work training in Chicago. When I returned, I decided I would find a real estate attorney and fight this properly. What I did not know then was that I would return to find much more than legal threats waiting for me. The corporate training center in Chicago was a sterile environment of fluorescent lighting and PowerPoint presentations, the exact opposite of my grandfather's warm, wooden cabin. While my colleagues diligently took notes about quarterly sales projections, my mind kept drifting back to Pine County. I had left a voicemail with a real estate attorney recommended by a friend, hoping to schedule a consultation immediately upon my return. During lunch breaks, I researched precedent cases of HOAs overstepping their authority, finding numerous examples that reinforced my position. On the final day of training, during a particularly monotonous presentation about supply chain optimization, my phone began vibrating repeatedly in my pocket. I slipped out of the conference room to find 6 missed calls from Bill Jenkins, an elderly neighbor whose property was adjacent to mine, but just outside the Pinecrest estate's boundary. Bill and my grandfather had been fishing buddies for decades. "They are at your place," Bill said, his voice urgent when I called him back. "Big trucks, construction equipment. I tried to tell them they had no right, but they showed me some kind of work order." My blood ran cold. "What kind of equipment, Bill?" I asked, already knowing the answer would not be good. "Bulldozer. One of those excavator things with a claw, about 5 or 6 workers. They started on the east side where the porch is. I tried calling the sheriff, but no one has shown up yet." I thanked him quickly, made a hasty excuse to my manager about a family emergency, and rushed to my car. The drive that should have taken 4 hours took just over 3, as I pushed well beyond the speed limit on every stretch of highway. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, my mind racing through scenarios, each worse than the last. The rain started as I turned onto the county road leading to the cabin. Just a light drizzle at first, but growing heavier with each passing mile. Through the rhythmic swipe of windshield wipers, I could see dark clouds gathering over the trees ahead. The universe itself seemed to be mirroring my darkening mood. Nothing prepared me for what I found when I finally rounded the last curve in the road. The bulldozer was still there, its yellow paint garish against the natural greens and browns of the forest. The east side of the cabin, the side with the hand-built stone fireplace, and the porch where I had spent countless evenings with my grandfather, was completely gone. Splintered wood and stone rubble lay scattered across the mud. The exposed interior of the remaining structure looked wounded, like the cross-section of a fallen tree. I slammed my car door and ran toward the site, rain now coming down in sheets. The workers were huddled under a makeshift tarp shelter, looking uncomfortable as I approached. The foreman stepped forward, a clipboard clutched in his hand. "You cannot do this," I shouted over the rain, my voice breaking. "This is private property. You have no legal right to be here." The foreman, a heavy-set man with a weathered face, looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Look, sir, we have a properly authorized emergency work order." He held out the clipboard, protected from the rain by a plastic cover. "Signed by the county inspector and the HOA president. States the structure was deemed unsafe and required immediate demolition." I snatched the clipboard, scanning the document through water droplets. The work order claimed my cabin had been inspected and found to have severe structural deficiencies posing immediate danger to surrounding properties. It bore the signature of Karen Williams and someone named Thomas Reynolds, apparently a county building inspector. "This is fabricated," I said, my voice steadier now, fueled by cold anger. "There was no inspection. No one contacted me as the property owner. This is illegal demolition and destruction of private property." The foreman shifted his weight. "I just follow the work orders, sir. All my paperwork is in order. If there is a dispute, you need to take it up with the county and whoever issued the order." He would not meet my eyes as he spoke. I pulled out my phone and began methodically photographing everything: the equipment, the workers, the destruction, and most importantly, the work order itself. One of the younger workers looked away when I pointed the camera in his direction. They knew something was wrong. They just did not care enough to stop. When the sheriff's deputy finally arrived an hour later, the rain had tapered to a drizzle. The demolition crew had stopped working but refused to leave the site. I explained the situation, showing the officer my property deed and pointing out the suspicious nature of the work order. Deputy Collins was sympathetic but frustratingly powerless. "I understand you are upset, Mr. Mitchell, and I would be too, but this appears to be a civil matter. The work order has the proper signatures, even if you dispute how they were obtained." He ran a hand over his face. "My suggestion is to get a lawyer immediately and file for an emergency injunction. That is the only way to legally stop this work." By the time the deputy left, darkness was falling. The demolition crew packed up for the day, promising to return in the morning to finish the job. I stood alone in the rain, surrounded by the broken remains of my grandfather's legacy. Picking up a shattered picture frame from the mud, one that had hung by the fireplace my entire life, I felt something crack inside me that had nothing to do with the broken glass in my hands. The deputy was right about one thing: I needed legal help, but I needed more than that. I needed answers, and I needed to understand exactly who I was fighting. Tomorrow I would begin a different kind of demolition, the systematic dismantling of whatever corrupt arrangement had led to this moment. As I walked back to my car, a strange calm settled over me. My grandfather had built this cabin piece by piece, through patience and determination. I would rebuild it the same way. But first, I had to ensure that those responsible would face consequences, just as permanent as what they had done to my family heritage. The county record's office opened at 8:00 a.m. sharp. I was waiting at the door by 7:30, having spent a sleepless night in a local motel, my mind racing with questions and strategies. The building was an imposing brick structure that had stood in the center of Pine County since the 1940s. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and dust, the accumulated history of thousands of land transactions, births, deaths, and legal proceedings. The records clerk, a woman in her 60s named Martha Simmons, regarded me with mild annoyance when I explained I needed access to all property records related to my land parcel and the surrounding area. "That is a considerable amount of documentation," she said, peering at me over reading glasses that hung from a beaded chain around her neck. "Some of those records go back to the original land grants. Do you have any specific date ranges in mind?" "I need everything," I insisted, "starting from whenever the land was first registered. My grandfather was Robert Mitchell. The property has been in our family for generations." At the mention of my grandfather's name, Martha's expression softened slightly. "Robert Mitchell, I remember him, stubborn as they come but honest, always did his paperwork properly." She nodded to herself. "Give me some time. The older records are not digitized. You will be looking at actual paper." 3 hours later, I sat surrounded by stacks of document boxes, land surveys, and deed registrations. At first, the task seemed overwhelming. Decades of paperwork, much of it written in faded ink and legal terminology from another era. But slowly, methodically, I began to piece together a story much larger than I had imagined. My grandfather had not just purchased the 5 acres where our cabin stood. According to the original deed from 1950, he had acquired 47 acres of woodland extending in all directions. A subsequent document showed he had purchased an additional 33 acres in 1963. The most interesting discovery came in a folder containing correspondence between my grandfather and the County Planning Commission from 1972. In those letters, my grandfather had formally registered a detailed survey of his entire property. He had also filed a series of deed restrictions, legal constraints that would apply to any future sale or development of portions of his land. These restrictions specifically required maintenance of natural woodlands, limited construction density, and prohibited certain types of development entirely. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded a large survey map from 1972. The yellow paper crackled with age, but the boundaries were unmistakable. Using a red pencil, my grandfather had outlined the full extent of his property, an irregular shape that followed natural features like creeks and ridgelines. With growing astonishment, I realized that a significant portion of what was now Pinecrest Estates lay within those red lines. "Martha," I called out, my voice echoing in the quiet archive room, "do you have records of land sales from my grandfather to any development companies, specifically anything in the last 20 years?" Martha disappeared into the archives and returned 30 minutes later with another box. "These are all the transactions involving that original parcel of land. Some portions were sold off in the 1980s and 1990s, but there is something odd here." She pulled out a folder. "According to this, about 20 acres at the eastern edge were sold to Pine Valley Development Corporation in 2019, after your grandfather's death." "That is impossible," I said. "My grandfather passed away 3 years ago, and the property transferred directly to me. He could not have sold anything in 2019. Martha frowned, adjusting her glasses. "Well, the signature here." She studied the document more closely. "This does not look like Robert's signature. I processed enough of his paperwork over the years to recognize it." A chill ran through me. "May I see that document?" The deed transfer bore a signature that superficially resembled my grandfather's, but lacked the distinctive loop he always put on the final L in Mitchell. More importantly, the notary stamp belonged to someone named Regina Williams. The connection was too coincidental to ignore. As the day progressed, I discovered more irregularities. The development company had filed building permits for land they did not fully own. The HOA formation documents included parcels that were never properly transferred. Most damning of all, I found a small notation on an environmental impact study that had been submitted for the development. Ownership verification waived per special authorization. By late afternoon, the picture was becoming clear. I called the elderly records clerk over again. "Martha, have you noticed anyone else researching these specific property boundaries recently? Maybe someone from Pinecrest Estates or the development company." Martha hesitated before answering. "Karen Williams was in here about 6 months ago with a man in an expensive suit. They spent a whole day going through these same records. She seemed frustrated when she left." The final piece fell into place when I discovered a folder containing all the deed restrictions my grandfather had filed. These legal constraints had never been lifted and would still apply to any development on the land, even if the land had been properly sold, which much of it had not been. As I carefully photographed each document with my phone, I felt a strange sensation, as if my grandfather were standing beside me, nodding in approval. He had not just built a cabin. He had created a legal fortress, documenting everything with meticulous care. The same attention to detail he had shown in selecting each log for our cabin, he had applied to protecting the land itself. The records clerk approached as I was organizing the documents to return them to their boxes. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked. I nodded, a new sense of purpose filling me. More than I expected, my grandfather was playing a much longer game than anyone realized. The law office of Henderson and Associates occupied the entire third floor of the only professional building in Pine County. James Henderson had been practicing real estate law for over 30 years, and his reputation for handling complex property disputes was what had brought me to his door. I had called ahead and emphasized the urgency of my situation, but nothing prepared me for his reaction when I spread the county records across his mahogany conference table. "This is extraordinary," Henderson said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he examined the property survey from 1972. "Your grandfather created what we call a shadow deed system, perfectly legal but rarely used anymore. He kept the larger property ownership quiet while maintaining complete legal control." I watched as the attorney methodically reviewed each document, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound portfolio. His initial skepticism had quickly given way to professional interest, and now, something approaching excitement. "Based on these records," Henderson continued, "Pinecrest Estates built approximately 40% of their development on land they do not actually own. Another 30% was built in direct violation of the deed restrictions your grandfather placed on the portions he did legally sell." "How is that even possible?" I asked. "Would not someone have checked the property lines before building an entire neighborhood?" Henderson removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. "In theory, yes. In practice, developments like this involve multiple contractors, subcontractors, and municipal approvals, all moving quickly and often relying on someone else's verification. Your grandfather's property boundaries followed natural landmarks rather than standard lot lines, making them easy to misinterpret if someone was being, let us say, less than thorough." Over the next 2 weeks, Henderson and I built our case methodically. We hired a professional surveyor who confirmed the original boundaries. We compiled evidence showing the HOA had been established through a series of questionable legal maneuvers. Most damning of all, we discovered that several board members, including Karen Williams, had approved construction without requiring proper surveys. "This goes beyond mere negligence," Henderson said one afternoon, showing me a stack of building permits. "These were all fast-tracked through the approval process with minimal documentation. That does not happen by accident." Our investigation took an unexpected turn when Henderson suggested we speak with other homeowners who had experienced problems with the HOA. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Several elderly residents had been forced to sell after receiving escalating fines for minor infractions. A young family had been pressured to accept a below-market offer after Karen personally cited them for violations other homes had been allowed to maintain. "She has been targeting specific properties," I realized, looking at a map where we had marked all the harassment cases. "Always the ones with the best views or strategic locations." Henderson nodded. "And guess who purchased most of those properties after the owners were forced out? Various LLCs, all ultimately connected to Pine Valley Development Corporation." The final piece clicked into place when Henderson's paralegal discovered financial records linking Karen Williams to the development company. She was not just the HOA president. She owned a 15% stake in the very company building the next phase of Pinecrest Estates. Every property she forced into sale directly benefited her financially. "We have enough for multiple legal actions," Henderson said, organizing our evidence into separate folders. "Fraudulent property transfers, violation of deed restrictions, illegal demolition of your property, conflict of interest in HOA enforcement, and potentially even forgery of your grandfather's signature on that 2019 land sale." I leaned back in my chair, taking in the scope of what we had uncovered. "What is our next step?" "Normally, I would suggest filing these complaints with the court immediately," Henderson replied. But given the nature of what we have found, I believe a different approach might be more effective. He outlined a strategy that was both legally sound and emotionally satisfying. We would request a special HOA meeting, citing an obscure bylaw that required board attendance for matters affecting property values. At that meeting, we would present our findings, not just to the board, but to all homeowners who wish to attend. The homeowners need to know their houses may have been built on improperly acquired land, Henderson explained. This affects everyone in Pinecrest Estates, not just you. And based on my experience, nothing motivates action quite like threatening someone's home. As we finalized our preparations, Henderson prepared formal legal actions against both the HOA as an entity and each board member personally. These would not be filed immediately but would be ready if needed. Karen Williams has been operating as if she is untouchable, Henderson said as we concluded our meeting. People like that never expect consequences until they arrive. That evening I stood at the edge of my property, looking at the remains of my grandfather's cabin in the fading light. The demolition had been halted after our initial legal warning, but the damage was already severe. The eastern wall and porch were completely gone, the interior exposed to the elements. Yet somehow, the destruction no longer filled me with despair. Instead, I felt a growing sense of purpose. My grandfather had built this cabin to last generations. More importantly, he had built a legal framework that would now protect it, and possibly bring justice to dozens of other homeowners caught in Karen's web. As the sun set behind the trees, I imagined him standing beside me, nodding with approval at what was to come. The Pinecrest Estates Community Center was designed to impress, with its vaulted ceilings, stone fireplace, and wall of windows overlooking an artificial pond. Tonight, however, the atmosphere was tense rather than welcoming. Word had spread about the special meeting, and the room was filled beyond capacity. Homeowners stood along the walls, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned. At the front of the room, the HOA board members sat behind a long table, with Karen Williams at the center, looking irritated by the unexpected turnout. I arrived exactly on schedule, accompanied by James Henderson and two county officials, the land records administrator, and a representative from the county assessor's office. We had coordinated their attendance through official channels, ensuring they brought relevant documentation bearing the county seal. This meeting was called to address alleged concerns about property values, Karen began, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone used to controlling such gatherings. Though I must say, Mr. Mitchell, your request was unusually vague about the specific agenda items. Henderson and I exchanged a glance as we set up our presentation materials. The projector hummed to life, displaying the original 1950 property survey of my grandfather's land. Thank you for accommodating this special session, I said, addressing not just the board but the entire room. Tonight is about property values, but perhaps not in the way you anticipated. Every person in this room needs to understand that their home may be built on land with serious ownership issues. Karen's smile tightened. That is a serious accusation. Perhaps you should choose your words more carefully. I have chosen them very carefully, I replied, advancing to the next slide. A composite map showing the current Pinecrest Estates development overlaid with my grandfather's property boundaries. The areas of overlap were highlighted in red, encompassing nearly half the neighborhood. This red area represents land that was never legally sold by my family, I explained, my voice steady. My grandfather, Robert Mitchell, owned these 80 acres from 1950 until his death 3 years ago. At that time, The entire property transferred to me. Murmurs spread through the crowd. One of the board members, a thin man with glasses, leaned over to whisper something to Karen. She shook her head dismissively. There was a proper land sale in 2019, Karen interjected. We have the documentation. Henderson stepped forward. You are referring to this document, he said, displaying the questionable deed transfer. Notarized by Regina Williams, your sister, I believe, and bearing a signature that 3 handwriting experts have confirmed is not Robert Mitchell's, especially considering Mr. Mitchell had already been deceased for several months when this was supposedly signed. The whispers in the room grew louder. Karen's face flushed, but she maintained her composure. These are complicated legal matters that do not concern most homeowners. If there are discrepancies, they can be addressed privately between the relevant parties. I disagree, I said firmly. Every homeowner here should know that my grandfather placed specific deed restrictions on any land he did sell. These restrictions prohibited the type of dense development Pinecrest Estates represents. I advanced to a slide showing the original deed restrictions. These legal constraints were never lifted and remain binding on the property. The county land records administrator spoke up for the first time. I can confirm these restrictions were properly filed and remain in the county records. They should have been flagged during any routine title search. Now the room erupted in concerned conversation. A woman in the second row stood up. Are you saying our homes were built illegally? What does this mean for us? It means, Henderson replied, that your HOA president and the development company she partially owns constructed your homes on land they did not fully own, while ignoring legally binding restrictions on the portions they did purchase. Several board members were now physically distancing themselves from Karen, sliding their chairs slightly away as if her problems might be contagious. The balding treasurer looked particularly pale. Furthermore, I continued, displaying a series of financial documents, we have evidence that Karen Williams has been selectively targeting certain homeowners with violations and fines, forcing them to sell at below market rates, and then acquiring those properties through shell companies connected to Pine Valley Development Corporation, a company in which she holds a 15% stake. Karen stood abruptly. This is slander. I will not sit here and... Perhaps, interrupted Henderson, you would prefer to explain why you authorized the illegal demolition of Mr. Mitchell's cabin using a fraudulent emergency work order, or why the county inspector whose signature appears on that order has no record of ever visiting the property. The room had fallen completely silent. Even the most skeptical homeowners were now staring at Karen with open suspicion. One by one, the other board members moved their chairs further away, creating a visible gap between themselves and their president. We have prepared legal actions against both the HOA as an entity and board members individually, Henderson added, his tone measured but firm. However, Mr. Mitchell is primarily interested in justice, not punishment. He has authorized me to present a framework for resolving these issues in a way that protects innocent homeowners while holding accountable those who knowingly participated in these actions. Karen attempted one last defense. This is absurd. You cannot possibly expect people to believe that an entire development was built without proper. I believe we have the county assessor here who can confirm that the proper procedures were not followed. I interrupted, nodding to the official who stood with a thick folder of documentation. As the evidence mounted, the atmosphere in the room transformed. The other board members, sensing the tide turning, began distancing themselves not just physically but verbally from Karen's decisions. The vice president admitted he had raised concerns about proper surveys but had been assured everything was in order. The treasurer confessed he had questioned certain financial transactions but had been told they were standard industry practice. By the end of the evening, Karen sat alone at the center of the table, her carefully constructed empire crumbling around her. The homeowners, initially skeptical of my claims, were now demanding answers about the status of their properties and what would happen next. The power had shifted completely, and everyone in the room knew it. Spring came early to Pine County the following year. The dogwoods were already blooming as I stood watching a construction crew carefully positioning the final roof beam on my rebuilt cabin. Unlike the demolition team that had torn it down, these workers moved with respect and precision, following blueprints that honored my grandfather's original design while incorporating modern structural improvements. The legal settlement had been comprehensive. The HOA's insurance company agreed to pay for complete restoration of my cabin after Henderson presented them with evidence of fraudulent actions by their client. We had worked with a historical architect to ensure every detail of the reconstruction matched the original whenever possible. We even located some of the original fixtures that had been salvaged from the debris. Karen Williams faced more serious consequences. The district attorney had filed criminal charges for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy after our evidence revealed the extent of her schemes. Her 15% stake in the development company was frozen pending the outcome of multiple lawsuits. Last I heard, she had moved out of state, her reputation in Pine County permanently damaged. The resolution for the homeowners had been my primary concern once justice for my property was secured. Working with county officials and legal experts, we established a framework that allowed current residents to obtain proper title to their land through a simplified process. I agreed to formally sell the portions of my property that had been developed, at nominal cost, provided the homeowners accepted certain conditions. These natural woodland buffers must remain undisturbed, I explained at a community meeting, indicating the green spaces on our new development plan. And any future construction needs to respect the environmental guidelines my grandfather established. Most homeowners readily agreed, relieved to secure legitimate ownership of their properties without financial ruin. Some even thanked me for revealing the truth before they invested in further improvements on legally questionable land. The HOA underwent a complete restructuring. The board members who had enabled Karen's actions resigned or were voted out. In their place, a diverse group of homeowners formed a new governance structure with transparent rules and limitations on authority. I declined a nomination to join, but agreed to serve as an advisor on historical and environmental matters. "Your grandfather would be proud," Bill Jenkins told me one evening as we sat on the newly rebuilt porch, watching fireflies appear among the trees. "Not just of the cabin restoration, but of how you handled everything. You found a way to get justice without punishing innocent folks who got caught up in Karen's schemes." The cabin itself, while faithful to the original, now featured subtle improvements. The stone fireplace had been rebuilt using the same river rocks my grandfather had collected decades ago. The wooden beams were sourced from sustainable local forests. Solar panels discreetly mounted on the back portion of the roof provided electricity without disrupting the cabin's rustic appearance. Perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the establishment of the Pine County Historical Property Trust. Working with county officials, I helped create legal protections for properties with historical significance throughout the region. The trust would ensure that other family legacies would not face the same threats mine had encountered. The first application has already been approved, the county preservation officer, informed me during the final inspection of my rebuilt cabin. The old Miller farm on the north side of the county. Been in their family since 1889. As summer approached, I found myself spending more time at the cabin than I had in years.